Hello everyone, and welcome back to part 3 of today's lecture series on reception and ancient art. And in this section I'm going to be discussing Neoclassicism and Romanticism and focusing on representations of architecture and the way in which landscape architecture and architects themselves adapted classical language in their works, especially in the 18th century. So I'm going to start with the works of Giovanni Battista Piranesi, who was an artist who created etchings and engravings, and especially is famous for a series known as the Vedute di Roma, or the Views of Rome. And here's one example in which we see a view of the Forum, the Roman Forum from the Capitoline Hill. Created in the 1740s and later. So he was working mainly in the latter half of the 18th century. And with the advent of printing, right, we saw earlier how manuscripts are these sort of one-shot productions, one-off productions. With the advent of the printing press and the development of the media of etching and engraving and woodcut and other printable drawings, we see the sort of expansion of circulation of these art prints. And so Piranesi's works actually become embroiled and connected with the culture of the Grand Tour, the sort of elite European society tradition of going on a tour of the great European monuments, with Rome and Florence and Venice being some of the real highlights there. The must-see monuments of the ancient world that are part of both the sort of societal, cultural education and the literal intellectual education of especially wealthy people at this time. And so the Vedute di Roma become these sort of token or souvenir type drawings that people could actually bring back, and they could be mass produced to show views of the city of Rome, sort of like postcards nowadays. So here are some more examples that you can see. We have a view here of the Pantheon, a view of the Baths of Diocletian, a view of part of Hadrian's Villa with statues within, and a view of Piazza del Popolo. And in each of these drawings, we can see that Piranesi has really focused on representing the ancient world as it stood at the time, but highlighting the ways in which nature has kind of taken over and the ruined state of these ancient structures. So we see in, for example, our picture of the Roman Forum, the half-buried Arch of Septimius Severus, the sort of half-buried columns of the Temple of Concord, Saturn over here, and a real emphasis on the way that this is a pastoral sort of area. We have people walking through, but also plants growing, trees growing up around these structures and growing off of the sort of from within the cracks of the stone itself. So life, nature taking back over these spaces over time. So this sort of sets up this very romantic view of the city and of these ruins and of this past world. And you have to remember that towards the end of this time period, right, around the turn, around the year 1800 and the turn between the 1700s and 1800s, that's when we have our sort of romantic writers traveling around Europe. At this time, we have Percy Shelley and Lord Byron, and these different figures who are kind of concerned with this idea of the fallen empire as a romantic theme, also operating in their works. So this idiom of romanticism arises at this time and becomes popularized alongside a more traditional way of interpreting the sort of visual idiom of the ancient world. So I want you to pause the lecture now and to look closely at one of the two following slides of Piranesi's etchings and just write 1 to 2 sentences about how Piranesi portrays the ancient world in relation to his contemporary society. So either this image right here, which shows the Arch of Constantine in Rome, or this image right here, which shows a statue of the goddess Roma in amongst some of the ruins, as well as you might recognize one of these reclining sarcophagi in the background. So just pause the lecture for a minute and then come back and complete the part B of the assignment at the end of the lecture. Okay, now that you've finished that little activity, I want to take you and just show you one example of the ways that we see neoclassical architecture existing in both an idiom that calls on the sort of formal symmetry, simplicity of design that we see in classical architecture that gets adapted into the neoclassical style, and also the romantic idiom of the ruinous version of the ancient world that we see in the romantic style, coexisting sort of within the same place. So just one example of this are a couple of places in Somerset, England, Bath in particular. So this is Prior House Park, which is constructed around 1472. And so we have this facade, which is much like a Corinthian style temple with a pediment. And then behind it, the sort of bulk of the house, these sort of interest in angular forms over the windows. You can see we have angular and curved semicircular dormers above the window, alternating, so an interest in the sort of repetition of curvilinear designs across the facade of a building, resulting in this harmonious view that is very embedded in the landscape in a way, but also stands out and provides a sense of order into the space. But if we look at some of the other features of the grounds here, here's one footbridge, a Palladian style footbridge, and we find similar bridges at other English estates at this time period as well. And in this example, you can see that the bridge is sort of designed to interact with the landscape by reflecting over the pool. There are some images of this structure that show that dynamic a little bit better. But it also has a little bit of a more rustic feel to it. It balances the sort of simplicity and the architectural design of the classical period, but takes away that sense of massiveness and a little bit places the architecture into the landscape in such a way that it appears to have grown into it, right? That it's become part of the landscape over time, perhaps been abandoned and rediscovered. And so we have this rather romantic Gothic sensibility that shows up as well. If we look at the actual city of Bath, we see the neoclassical structural idiom being used as well. This, for example, is a picture of the pump room. So Bath was, even as far back as the Roman period, a spa town, and it remains as such and becomes very popular in the late 18th century and early 19th century as a place where people would go to take in the healing waters and also engage in society activities and spa-like activities. So we see again pediments, we see columns, we see arches, we see pedimental triangular structures being mixed with rounded structures, a lot of repetition of forms in order to create a sense of rhythm and evenness and structural stability at the same time. And then we also see, this is also in Bath, this is a series of townhouses known as the Royal Crescent, which again picks up on that repetition of colonnades moving around and sort of follows the outline of an almost circus-like structure, this large, round, curving wall with a harmonious repetition of forms throughout. So this is a series of townhouses that are arranged in such a way that they all look outwards onto a lawn, which also draws upon this idea of rus in urbe, or the countryside within the city, right? So all of these townhouses have outside their windows, their front windows, a view that looks like it's looking onto the countryside, which is something that we also see at Prior Park, right? This integration of even a simulation of the appearance of the countryside within the city as a value. And so we can kind of see that drawing off of the ideas of otium that are associated with Roman villas, and especially with elite spa-style culture in the Bay of Naples back in the Roman period. And finally, here we have another example from the UK. This is the Stowe House, a very magnificent estate in Buckinghamshire in the UK. Again, we see that the building itself kind of draws upon that impressive facade with the appearance of colonnades and openings onto an open landscape front that looks very similar on a superficial view to our Roman seaside maritime villas that we've seen. So again, recalling that villa structure and recalling that villa culture that never really goes away. It becomes sort of transforms slowly into multiple different versions of cultures, but one of those is this sort of British countryside estate culture. Here's another view so that you can see some of the details of the way that this house represents that neoclassical idiom. Here in the details you can see, for example, we have dentils like you would see on a Greek temple. We have little garland swags which are done in relief in the facade to give it some decorative flavor that again kind of almost recalls a sacred space, right? You would expect this in, say, the Areopagus. So it's similar to this temple architecture that we see adapted into this elite domestic realm. And dotted throughout the estates, we have various of these sort of romantic temple-like structures. One of the landscape architects that worked at Stowe was Capability Brown, who is famous for sort of working in this romantic realm and including things like follies in his landscape design. So fake temples that are, or hermitages that maybe even had a real live hermit in them to decorate the landscape and make it appear wild and kind of recall even some of those ideas of the dangerous landscape, the mystical landscape, the way that myth and reality could coexist in the wild, adapting those ideas and bringing them into the English country estate. But we see a lot of resonance between that and some of the ways that the ancient Romans and ancient Greeks thought about their landscapes as well as realms where the mythological could play out in reality, or you could cross these kinds of liminal boundaries between worlds. And the interior details of the estate as well really call upon some of these neoclassical Roman ideas, even the way in which the Renaissance artists saw fourth style and third style Roman wall paintings and started to paint things like grotesques that drew upon the little floating figures we see in those styles. Here we have a rotunda with statue niches, columns, colored marble, that idea of sort of lavish, public-looking architecture being used on the inside of the house to create an impressive, public-looking space. Here's that rotunda again, you can see. And then also we have a somewhat damaged relief in plaster that mimics the classical style. We have a wine vessel, a crater. We have figures who are dancing and carrying wine vessels around. So we have a kind of Bacchic dance being shown in some of the details of the rooms as well. So the idiom carries over from the landscaping to the interior, but calling upon different aspects of the classical world, right? We have our simplicity, our order, these ideas of solidity, harmony, and proportion that are really important to Neoclassicism as well as the sort of Greek classical idiom. But then we also have an interest in more the styles of life that are operative in the daily world, such as wall paintings and even to some extent reliefs, which straddle that boundary public and private, I think, playing out all here within one place, and the sort of wild landscape as well. So to do part B, what I'd like you to do is just to write 2 to 3 sentences on the following questions. So how do your observations about Piranesi's views of Rome in part A compare with the ways you see architects and landscape architects interpreting classical styles and drawing on classical aesthetic themes in their works at Bath and Stowe House? And then how do these compare with the neoclassical buildings we looked at a few classes ago, back when we were still meeting together, in Washington, D.C. So thinking about the ways that public spaces, semi-public, semi-private show spaces, and also private spaces, if you want to think about that as well, all draw on these different classical aesthetics in different ways. I'll see you in the next lecture. Thank you very much.